Steve is from New York, and Steve says, a youth pastor trying to find a way out, lack of belief. This should be quite interesting. Steve, how you doing?
Monumentally nervous. I was originally, when I learned of this show, going to call to try and challenge you guys, but after the events of the past week, I wanted to kind of ask for help instead.
Sure. What you need, man?
You're the one that's known as Deconstruction Zone on YouTube, right, Justin?
That is accurate, yeah.
Yeah, I was over the past couple years as a youth pastor, begrudgingly teaching AIG material. I started to ask a lot of questions and seek answers outside of the church because they just refused to answer a lot of questions I had. So I've been trying to deconstruct to a less toxic Christianity.
Yeah, I was doing the same thing when I was in ministry.
I heard about you as someone to avoid. Simply told to not look for you.
Whatever you do, don't listen to Deconstruction Zone. It'll make you lose your faith.
It was you, Matt Dillahunty, and Amin Ra or something like that. Aaron, it's Aaron. I was told not to look for you three.
Well, I mean,
I decided to look you guys up first.
So my theory was, when I was a Christian, and so, I used to engage in apologetics when I was a young Christian and whatnot. But my theory was always this: you should never be afraid to question something and to dialogue with people who disagree with you, because sometimes you have to be wrong before you can be right. And there's times even now, like I think I'm in the right, but I could be wrong about something, and I'll never know it until somebody proves me wrong. So like when people, and this was the problem I had when I was in the church, people say things like, when I went to seminary, don't go to seminary and lose your faith. They call it the cemetery for a reason. Well, the reason why they have to say these things is because it turns out that there's a lot of good arguments against Christianity, and they don't want you to be, fall prey. But the reality is, me personally, I think the arguments against Christianity are just stronger than the arguments for Christianity, or else I would still be a Christian, and I didn't want to be a non-Christian. I didn't desire to leave. I left kicking and screaming. I was drug away from my faith.
I don't think I'm at that point just yet, but I was recently actually... a lot of the arguments you guys are talking about regarding the Moses story, I was bringing up some of those with my pastor and trying to steer my Sunday school classes away from the stuff that I now know is historically inaccurate. And I got in quite a bit of trouble with the church for that. And they didn't let me in the building today.
Well, I'll tell you what, the church is not a great place to deconstruct. I deconstructed privately, and I didn't drag it into the church. And then when I was done serving my term, I quietly left without causing a disturbance. And I'm okay with that. My goal is not to convert anyone to my opinion. But when you're looking for answers, the church is kind of the only resource you have, right? So, but I think there are even stronger evidences for Christianity not being true other than the Old Testament, because you can say, well, listen, the Old Testament wasn't to be completely true. Part of it is mythology, but Christians will still say, but the Jesus stuff, that stuff's all true. So it's okay if the Old Testament's mythology, as long as the New Testament's not mythology. But the problem is the New Testament's mythologized as well. And I think the biggest problem with the New Testament, and this for me was the straw that broke the camel's back, was the fact that when you're really acquainted with the messianic prophecies, Jesus didn't fulfill a single messianic prophecy. And then when you look at the prophecies that the Gospels claim that he fulfilled, he didn't. Half of them aren't even prophecies. The ones that are prophecies, he didn't actually fulfill, like Zechariah 9, verses 9 through 10. Listen, congratulations on riding a donkey. I've been on a donkey too. That's not what the prophecy is about.
Two donkeys.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'll give him some benefit of the doubt. Riding two donkeys is hard. I don't know if he had to like plank across them or if he just was really good at straddling. I don't know what his situation was. Maybe he lounged, across two donkeys. But the fact of the matter was the prophecy in Zechariah is not just about a guy riding a donkey. It's about an actual king who cuts off the enemies of Israel. It says he's going to cut off the chariots and the war horse and the battle bow. This is a victorious king in battle who defeats Israel's enemies, which is alignment with the rest of the Old Testament prophecies. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if that's what the prophecy is about, does the fact that the dude rode a donkey mean anything? No, it doesn't mean nothing to me. I rode a donkey. I'm not the Messiah.
Yeah, I was one of the things I got in a bit of trouble with was looking at like trying to find where the prophecies came from, and I was trying to find like where the story of Lucifer was and everything, and I just was like, this doesn't quite make as much sense. But those weren't so much the main contentions I was having. The main contentions I was having were like a lot of the, especially with the stuff that's going on in the country right now, a lot of the stuff that like the anti-gay and anti-trans stuff I've found, it just doesn't seem to have, well, I found the basis that they were using for that, but I also found the basis for a lot more that they're not teaching. And I was asking them why they weren't bringing up this kind of stuff, and if they're going to bring up the other stuff, the anti-gay stuff, but they wouldn't talk about the rest of the terrible stuff that I was finding, which I didn't realize how much I'd taken out in context in my Sunday school classes. Because
there's a lot of horrible stuff
and everything, and they avoided a lot of stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of horrible stuff in the code, the Mosaic code. And so, for example, Leviticus 20:13 is where you get the prohibition of a man lying with a man as though a woman. And you're right, Christians will jump on this and say, yeah, obviously it's a sin. It's an abomination. And it gets roughly repeated in Romans chapter 1. But the problem is, as you've noted, is that they want to ignore a lot of the other rules. You know what I mean? For example, is it wrong to practice witchcraft? Kind of. We don't really know. The New Testament doesn't talk about it. God talks about it. Is it wrong to stone a woman if she's not a virgin on her wedding night? Well, I mean, according to Deuteronomy 22, if she doesn't bleed on her wedding night on that sheet, she should be stoned. If somebody causes your neighbor to worship another god, they entice your Christian neighbor to go worship another god, should their family be drug out of their houses and stoned? Well, I mean, according to Deuteronomy chapter 13, the answer to that is yes. So there's a lot of laws in the law of Moses that even if you're a Christian and you think, listen, that was temporary, Galatians 3:23 says it was a temporary schoolmaster until Christ came. Even if you think it was temporary, was it ever good, really? Like, imagine 100 years before Jesus came. Was it a good thing to be stoning people because a man had a relationship with a man? Was it a good thing to be stoning women who didn't bleed on their wedding night, even though about half of them physiologically would have bled in the first place, because not all women bleed the first time they do the deed? These aren't good things, even if you think the law was temporary. They were never good. Slavery, Leviticus 25, Exodus chapter 21, Genesis chapter 15, and elsewhere, Isaiah chapter 14. Was slavery ever good? If it was never good, then why do we accept that God gave commands for his people to own slaves and even idealized it? In Isaiah 14, he idealizes the idea of making the Babylonians slaves to the Israelites. Why?
That's quite heavy there.
How literally does your denomination and your church take the Bible?
Personally, I'm not too attached to a literal idea of a huge portion of it, but my church is full-blown answers in Genesis. Oh. And I've had a lot of problems with that because they want me to be a
Right.
Sunday school teacher. They want me to teach them stuff by the book and like by this specific book. And it's like, I know so much of this doesn't make a lot of sense, which they're blaming that on my college science classes.
Whatever you do, don't get an education.
Because college science classes will debunk about 90% of what they say. Basic college.
I've been able to test some of this stuff myself.
Yeah, but so the problem is that nobody can take the Bible literally, because if you take it word for word literally, you end up being an atheist for a number of reasons. But there are two stories of Genesis, two separate stories that if you take literally, contradict each other. And so you have to resolve that by interpreting the Bible. So you're not taking the Bible literally. It's the same thing with the Noahic flood. There are two different stories that are conflicting in details, and you can't take it literally. You have to harmonize, you have to interpret in order to come up with only one story. And this is something that repeats in the Bible over and over again, where we get two completely different stories that get added in there. And so you can't take the Bible literally and have one Genesis story or have one Noahic flood story. You just can't. And for the Noahic flood story, we're going to ignore the heat problem that even Answers in Genesis says is a problem for their version, for any of their versions of that. But you have these multiple stories, right?
The Earth like molten.
Yes, you would end up with Earth as plasma if under almost any version of the flood story. But there's two of them, right? And that's kind of the problem when you say you're going to take the Bible literally, is the Bible has double stories. And Justin, I want to say there's a triple of. But
yeah, there is. It's the story of the wife of the patriarch being taken. So the first happens with Abraham and Sarai in Egypt, and then a second time in Gerar, and then again with Isaac and Rebekah with the king of Gerar, which at this time would have been like 140, but who's counting?
Yeah. So you can't take the Bible literally, otherwise you end up with these problems. You have to interpret your way out of them
pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Right. I think, the hard thing with the Bible is that it makes definitive claims that you can't question, right? But at some point you have to start cutting parts out, doing what Thomas Jefferson did. Well, listen, we got to rip those pages out. Obviously that's nonsense. But let's hold on to this other stuff over here, right? But at some point in time, when you've ripped out enough pages, you have to look at what's left of the book and be like, would I really say that this thing is from God when I have to rip out this much of it that I know isn't true? We know there's no firmament. We know that the earth isn't flat, even though the Bible talks about it like it's flat. Job 38:14 calls it clay beneath a seal. It's formed like clay beneath a seal, which is a flat disc. So like, we know there's no dome over the sky, and God isn't sitting enthroned at the top of the dome. But that's what the Bible teaches, right? So we can like wish it away and say, well, it's an allegory or it's a mythology. But at some point we just have to ask ourselves, like, if like all the stuff we don't like about the Bible, we have to either remove it or mythologize it, then like, I don't know. It just seems like it's not really that useful of a book if every time we read it, we have to try to make problems go away. Like if the book was from God, we should be able to read it and be like, oh, that shit makes sense. Oh, it tells me about this thing I never knew. I never would have known that if I didn't read the book, but it doesn't do that. We have to keep apologizing for the Bible. The Bible has had the largest team of lawyers for the last 2,000 years, and we still cannot get a true verdict on the Bible, even with millions and millions of lawyers apologizing for it, which tells me it's not a trustworthy book.
Yeah, that's the point kind of where I'm at now. I'm wondering with how much of it, if any, I should be taking seriously, because there's so much I've learned that is just demonstrably wrong about it, morally and literally.
And I would say this too, like, deconstruction is a process, and everybody's process is a little bit different. And so like I'm an atheist, right? But when I left Christianity, I didn't go from Christianity directly into atheism. In fact, I've been pretty vocal. Like it is possible that there could be some kind of God. Now, I see no evidence for a God, which is why I don't believe in a God. But like, I'm not saying that you should leave Christianity and just become an atheist. What I'm suggesting, though, is that, I mean, I think that's the most defensible position, but I think what you should do is be honest with yourself, right? Like if you're looking at the data and the data doesn't add up to Christianity being true, just start asking yourself, okay, well, what's next? Where do I go from here? Because if you dwell in this area, in this arena, where like you're surrounded by people who believe this thing, even though you're not really convinced by it anymore, like what is this doing for you, right? I think society is always better off trying to live and be authentic with what is true to them. You know, what do you think is true, and living by that truth? I don't think Christianity benefits you once you get to the point where you're ready to throw half of it out.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out where I stand now.
It takes time. It takes time.
Leaves me a lot of questions, but as I've already said, they don't want to answer any of them.
No, well, for them. So if you're a church or a religious establishment, and you've got somebody, especially somebody of authority, that's questioning, you've got to go into protection mode. You've got to protect your flock, which means you're going to do one of two things. You're going to try to convince that person that they need to stop questioning and get back in line, or you got to show them the door. Those are the two options that you're going to have. What you don't want is somebody in the church, like a youth pastor or an associate pastor, who's now questioning and deconstructing, because now you are risking other people in the church deconstructing. So at some point, one of two things is going to happen. They're going to shut you down and say you get in line or you get out. That's what's going to happen.
Right. I would like to recommend
so far
the Clergy
they've
Project.
Mostly shown me the door. Yeah, your call screener was suggesting the Clergy Project thing. I have a tab up looking at it now. I was looking at it, and it seems maybe a good option.
Yeah, and because they will try and keep your identity as secret as possible, right? Pardon?
Yeah, I went by one of my online names, but is the Clergy Project is it just for atheists, or would it
no
questioning?
It's for any member of the clergy questioning their faith.
Right.
And it's set up specifically to protect your identity, because one of the ideas behind it is you could be, you're a youth pastor, and there are other pastor types as well who may actually be, their livelihood depends on being a pastor. And so the Clergy Project is also set up to help you make that transition from being a pastor into something more secular. Whether you're an atheist or not, it doesn't really matter. They're not, atheists don't go door to door preaching. In fact, we don't do a heck of a lot of preaching. The closest we get is something like this show.
Right. And, now would be a good time to dialogue with people that are currently deconstructing, and probably talk to a therapist as well who's familiar with the process. I have a very good friend of mine. In fact, she's got a super chat that we're going to read here in a minute, who went through seminary. She went to seminary like me. She's got a PhD. She's a therapist now, but she specializes in helping people through deconstruction. So I would also recommend getting into contact with a good therapist, because the deconstruction process is hard. Some people are going to turn their backs on you, by the way. It's not going to be pretty, because when you start questioning the foundation of your belief, then other people take it to be a challenge to them, and they get offended. In fact, in my life, most people have taken it pretty well that I deconstructed and left the faith, but there was a couple occasions where people were like upset with me for doing it. Like I had a choice in it. I didn't choose to do this.
Yeah, I'm lucky with my family and my fiance in that regard. They're all on my side. Yeah. They're like, oh, you go on your journey. It's okay. But the rest of the church, not so much.
It's great to have that support. Not everybody does.
Right.
Yeah, I'm lucky.
Well, listen, If you need anything, my email address is on my YouTube channel, The Deconstruction Zone on YouTube. If you need anything, shoot me an email. I'll make sure I get you hooked up with some people that can help and get you plugged into a community where you can, be safe in dialogue and find the assistance that you need.
Thank you very much. And you guys have been much less scary than I was led to believe, which I kind of figured, but thank you for that.
We try not to bite.
Thanks for calling in, Steve, though. We appreciate your phone call.